Tech Nuggets, Network Manager. This Tech Nugget's going to cover Network Manager, which is a piece of software used to manage your Ethernet cards in a Linux system. Different versions of Network Manager have come and gone, both in popularity and implementation, with different distributions. So I'm going to, for our practical demo today, use Ubuntu 18.04, which it kind of has a half and half relationship with Network Manager. So Network Manager in its basic form is a piece of software used to manage your Ethernet card. Set IP addresses, DNS servers, gateways, turn it on and off, lets you save configurations to a file, so if you move locations and you want to restore all your settings easily, you can do that at the command line or in the GUI or in the text interface, which we'll talk a little about here as we go along. The practical demo is going to use Ubuntu, which is a Debian distribution, and it kind of has a half and half relationship with Network Manager. If you were to install Ubuntu Desktop right off the website, it will absolutely have Network Manager installed both at the command line and in the GUI, and it's what it uses to manage NICs in standard desktop Ubuntu 18.04. Does a pretty good job. Lots of support for wireless cards, lots of support for all sorts of other things, and a nice little GUI to go with it to let you do that kind of stuff. However, if you install Ubuntu Server, you will not get Network Manager, and if you want it, you'll need to do an apt install Network Manager to get it. Server uses a series of YAML files that allow you to configure the NIC, and even after installing Network Manager, you would have to go into those YAML files and tell it, hey, go use Network Manager, don't use the current system of YAML files. And that is a Google search for you to figure that out if you need to know that. Once you've got Network Manager installed in a command line environment is pretty much what we're going to talk about. Now, this command lines will be useful in GUI as well as in a server only with Network Manager installed environment, but we're kind of more worried about that. A GUI is usually pretty self-explanatory to click your way through. So we'll be focusing on NMCLI and NMTUI, which are the two primary ways of working with Network Manager in a command line interface. All right, so NMCLI is our basic command, and by running it, you can get a bunch of output on the screen that'll tell you about Ethernet cards and connectivity. It just kind of gives you a basic overview of what's going on with Ethernet cards in the system. It's a reasonably good place to start when you want to understand what's going on. Now, NMCLI device status, or NMCLI-D, which is the short version, a lot of these sub-commands have a shortened letter or 2 or 3 letters that you can use, will give you a device status. So that will be things more specific about your Ethernet card, hardware level kind of discussions. The NMCLI connection show, or NMCLI-C, will be about connections. NMCLI and Network Manager in general works on this concept of connection profiles, basically. So you have a grouping of settings that you want, you apply them to the NIC, and then as you down and up the NIC, the entire profile is applied. So a lot of what we'll see will be done at the connection level and not at the device level, because NMCLI takes the profile and applies it to the device. But you can use NMCLI to see the devices in your system. The last one I added here is because NMCLI is useful when you want to see your list of Wi-Fi cards or Wi-Fi devices, and more importantly, networks that you can connect to for Wi-Fi. In a command line environment, apparently it's very difficult to work with the wireless card and all the different wireless parts, and NMCLI apparently makes it much, much easier when you want to connect to different networks. And this last line, the NMCLI dev Wi-Fi list, if you have a working Wi-Fi card, will show you all the networks you can currently see and will help with connecting to that. It was one of the things I ran across while I was working with looking for information on NMCLI. Was a lot of people had information about how to use NMCLI to work with Wi-Fi cards, because command line environment, that can be very difficult. All right, so some basic things we can do with Network Manager. Tab, your tab completion is really going to be your buddy in this case, because there's a lot of options, and if you're looking for a specific one, you can kind of work your way down the command line, and using tab will give you different options. So the first one will just be NMCLI-C tab, and you'll get a variety of verbs: add, remove, modify. There's several others. Add, remove, modify are the big ones that we tend to use. So if you want to create a new connection profile, you use add. In our case, a lot of times we want to modify one. So some of the other commands that you'll see here beneath, NMCLI C mod is for modify. And I've used path 1 because it's easy to show on the screen, but you could also use a connection name, and we'll see that in the practical demo where you could say wired connection 1 is often what you would see, which is where the 1 in path 1 comes, but you could call it Bob's settings, and that would work. And the problem with Bob's settings is Bob's settings has a space in it, so that has to be escaped out, and that can be kind of long and interesting to work with. So in this case, I've used path 1, and again, in the practical demo, we'll see a little of that. On the third line here, though, we can see we get into the things we need to actually set IP addresses. So I put it here for IP period tab because there's a bunch of options at this point. And the first one we're interested in is method. Normally Ethernet cards come up set for DHCP, so they're set to auto, both in desktop and in server, because it defeats the chicken and the egg problem of how do I get updates and how do I get anything on this box to start with. Oftentimes, especially in server, the first thing we want to do is go set an IP address, perhaps after we've run updates. So setting it to manual says, hey, we're going to set a manual IP address. So the next 3 lines here you can see are going through and setting an IP address, a gateway, DNS, that kind of stuff. And if you've done an IPv4 period tab, you'll get a bunch of those options and be able to see them and that kind of stuff. And I've given some examples here. IPv6 is the same way. We put an IPv6 period tab. The commands are basically the same. There's method, there's addresses, there's gateway, there's DNS. The one that I can note that under method, instead of disable, which we get in IPv4, in IPv6 we get ignore. It took me a long time to find that, which is why I mention it here. It's basically a way of turning the Ethernet card to stop listening for that protocol. The NIC is on at a physical layer, but it's not listening for that protocol at a layer 3. All right, so once we've got settings into it, none of them will kick in. Yeah, that's real frustrating. In a lot of GUI operating systems, Windows, when you hit OK on the dialog box, those settings are put into play right then. That is not true in Network Manager. You have to, the easiest way is to down the NIC and then up it, which is why I list those commands here, NMCLI, C, down, and the connection name. You could use path 1, whatever connection name you prefer to use will work, and that will turn the NIC off, and then we use up to bring it back up. This will bring the NIC up and use the new settings. Even in the GUI, this is true. If you go into the GUI and you make settings changes in the GUI, they will not take place until you go back and flip the little off and then flip it back on, and then the new settings will take effect. This is a little confusing. Most people don't realize that's going on. You could effectively reboot the box. That would also do it, although that's the long way. Tab completion really is your friend with a lot of these things, so keep that in mind as you work your way through it. The best way to see your IP address after you've downed the NIC and up it is to do IP space A. NMCLI does a lot of things, but showing your IP address and settings is not one of them. It is used to set them, not show them. Why? I don't know why. IPA will show you your add IP settings. So IP space route will show you your route table, that kind of stuff. One other thing to note is that you will need sudo access to do any of these NMCLI commands because this is root kind of level access to change Ethernet cards. So a lot of the commands will be prefixed with sudo NMCLI. I didn't put that in here because the command itself doesn't need it in some cases. The last thing I want to talk about is NMTUI, which is a text interface. So it's done at a command line. You can run it, but it gives you a nice little ASCII text interface to go through and set some of these options. You can use NMCLI to set it and then go look at it in NMTUI and edit it. They're all editing the same thing, so you can go back and forth. We'll look at it a little in the practical demo. NMCLI is a programmatic way, so if you've got a script that's running to set commands and set things in there, it can be a very easy way to make sure you've hit all your different settings you need. NMTLI is a great way to go edit something real fast and make sure that it's there and that kind of thing. All right, so we will head on to the practical demonstration, and that way you can see some of this stuff in action. All right, so we have my VM here that I've maximized my command window so that we can see it all very nicely, and we'll start in on away on some of these commands. You know, just your basic NMCLI command will just give you some basic overview. The top line is the two pieces of information that generally we've been talking about. On the left side, ENS33 in this case is the hardware label for my Ethernet card. So most of the time we would call it ETH0 in a generic context. Different flavors of Linux have gone back and forth about calling it ETH0 or using a manufacturer name. I believe ENS is what they use for Intel cards. Where it gets the 33 from, couldn't tell you. You can get this piece of information from a couple other places. The right side where it says connected to, wired connection 1, that's Network Manager's connection profile that it's built for the first Ethernet card that it finds. If you have 4 of them, you'll probably have wired connection 1, 2, and 3, and 4. That's kind of normal. I was wrong. You can actually see your IP address here in NMCLI. It shows you your routes and that kind of stuff too. I apologize. I didn't even look at it that closely. So you can see some of the basic settings that go with that. It's fairly useful. If we do NMCLI-D, we'll just get a very short list of devices, and it kind of gives us the shorter version of what we just saw. So we can see ENS33, what type it is, if we're Wi-Fi or wired, or if we've got other devices that Network Manager can manage, and we get a connection profile name. So if we're looking for that kind of stuff, we'll notice loopback is listed in both of them. Wow, it even gives us DNS information. This is great. NMCLI is awesome. So NMCLI-C will kind of flip it around, right? It's going to give us connection information, so it's going to list our connection name first. This is the first time we've seen what we would consider a UUID. It's a unique identifier for that device. It tells us the Ethernet type, and then of course it gives us the hardware label that's in the system. In several times when we work with these different things and we want to add and modify things, we can use name, we can use the connection name, or we can use the UUID. Now the UUID is going to be unique, so if we need it to be programmatic where we're going to take this script from one machine to another, we won't be able to use the UUID, but we can use the connection name as long as it's got the same connection name on every machine. All right, so let's talk a little about that. CLI, C for connection. And we can see here it thumps at me telling me I've got options. So these are all the verbs, right? This is I want to work with connection, add, clone, delete, down, up, all that kind of good stuff. And in our case, we're going to say modify. And again, we're going to tab, and I want to see what I get. Well, I've got options here. I can ask for help. I can do it by ID, which would be a UUID if I put ID and then the UUID. I can do it by path, which we'll see here in a little bit. And the last one is wired connection. So if I put a capital W and I hit tab again, you'll see it fills it in. Now, because it's got spaces in it, it's going to want to do some interesting things with it. So in my demos earlier, I used the path command. And you can see here, I hit tab on path, and 1 is listed on the left. But you can see on the right, you can see it's settings 1, and I only have 1. So that's the same thing as saying wired connection 1. We could use either one, several different ways to refer to it. I haven't used the path command a ton, but I've gotten nailed a couple times with spaces in my connection names or not spaces or whatever. So I've started to use path a little more often. And again, we can hit tab, and it wants to display a ton of possibilities. And in our case, we really want to work with IPv4, so we're going to put IPv4 period, and we're going to hit tab, and we're going to see there's a bunch of different options here. We can set DNS and DHCP, and addresses tends to be the big one everybody wants, where I can set an address on my Ethernet card, and at this point I would type in, like that, and that would set an IP address on it for us. More importantly, at the very beginning, we usually want a method. And if we type tab, we can see there's auto, disable, link local, manual, and shared. Now, if you've got a GUI desktop, which I do in this case, you can see these same options up here in wired settings. And we'll go up and look real quick here. And there's my wired connection profile. And you'll see in here, I've got the same kind of options: automatic, manual, link local, disable. On IPv6, I get a automatic. There's some DHCP only. There's several settings for v6, and we're not going to go into that right now, but we can see that's here. And if we go look at the v6 version, method, we can see that we don't get disabled anymore. We get ignore. This is an NMCLI implementation discussion. Why it's disable here and ignore there, I don't know. They probably haven't gotten their programmers to agree on the right term. If you need to turn it off, it can be very useful to do that kind of stuff. We can do ignore, and we have to down and up the NIC in order to get it to take the settings. So NMCLI, C, down, and path 1. Turns the NIC off, and you can see in the background the GUI just turned it all off. And we could either flip the little switch here, or we can say up, and it'll turn the NIC back on. And we can see we're set to disable, which is apparently the same thing as ignore. All right, so this is kind of different ways to go through and work with it. You can tab complete a lot of this stuff. I've been tending to do more of that IPv4. There's a lot of different interesting things you can do with it if you want to set route tables, gateways, DNS. These are the kind of things you'll be able to do with that. All right, so let's talk a little about NMTUI, which is a really great command. NMTUI. This is an ASCII menu system. You see it occasionally in different CLIs where they want to give you a menu without having to build a whole GUI for it. We can do a variety of different things in it. We can edit connection. You can see here we've got connection settings, and we can go to edit. We can add ones if we want to add multiples or something like that. I think if you just click on it, it's the same as edit. And you can see here we can rename the profile. We can see the hardware name for it. If we go down and hit hide show, we can see a variety of different options for it. Where we come down in here and show. If we go up to automatic, we can switch it to manual. These are all the same kind of things that we would have seen using NMCLI, and we can set it to be whatever we want. Now we got to put a gateway in. It probably wants some sort of mask. We can put a gateway in. All right, we can add DNS servers by hitting add. That kind of thing. And we can, at the end, at the bottom, we can hit OK. I'm tabbing to get along. You can also use your arrow keys, but tab will get you from the next option to the next option. We can hit OK. And at the end, we go back. Now, remember, I haven't downed and upped the NIC yet, so it's not going to take any of my settings, no matter what I do. So if we go look, none of those settings have taken effect yet because I haven't downed and upped the NIC yet. So if we go back in, there we go. That's what I get for going down. There we go. We can activate a connection. So we turn it off, turns the NIC off, turn it on, turns the NIC on. It's the same thing as up and down that we used previously. So, oops. And we can see here my settings took effect in the GUI, and they'll take effect here. NMTUI is really great when you want to go edit a setting. You've programmatically added a bunch of things with NMCLI, but NMTUI will let you go in and make that one. Oh, I typoed that thing, and I don't want to have to go dig up the whole command again, and I can make a quick edit, and that's pretty useful. All right, well, that was the Network Manager Tech Nugget. We'll see you all next time.